We ended our colloquium with a lecture on a murder in the 17th century, and now we're back talking about some more murders. Lawrence doesn't need any introduction. He's as much a scholar of legal theory as he is of cinema and a history enthusiast. The theme is very interesting, and I would say that for a lot of us of a certain vintage, our introduction to courts was through cinema, because you had like all those films at that last scene, you know, which was a courtroom scene and a very distinguished milord sitting there, which should tell us something, because we don't have those kind of scenes any longer in the movies any longer. But I'll stop my introduction here. Over to you, Lawrence.
Thanks, Tanuja. Thanks, Yogesh, and welcome to those who joined us online. I'm absolutely delighted to begin the new year with an event like this, and for us at AUD, where we've become accustomed to meeting only through crises related to employment and administration, etc. It's a nice break to actually begin the year with an academic and an intellectual event, because as someone who I will be quoting a little bit from a little later in the talk, Mark Seltzer describes the contemporary as a time of a wound culture, that you're brought together by the idea of woundedness. And I think in AUD we've experienced that rather well over the last couple of years. So it's also nice to know that we can be brought together by things other than woundedness. So my talk today is titled The Affective Afterlife of Legal Archives, a literary and lurid journey through K L Gauba's legal thrillers. A little bit of a background on Gauba, because he's not well known at all today. And I didn't know K L Gauba myself. In 2016, I was teaching and designing a course on great legal trials that shaped Indian history in the US. And I encountered a book by K L Gauba, which you see up on the screen there, which was on famous and historic trials. And that really led me to this kind of rabbit hole of becoming obsessed with this man for the last couple of years. None of his books are easily available in India. There are a couple of his books available in the Nehru Memorial. And very ironically, through a horrendous program called the PL 480, which mandated that India sends books in exchange for the interest that we were repaying on the loan that India had taken for wheat. A lot of the books that are not available in India are found, of course, in the South Asian libraries in the US. And through the PL 480 program, I managed to excavate a lot of K L Gauba's work. But why we do K L Gauba today, there's something interesting, which is that K L Gauba passed away in 1981. And very few people in Bombay, the city that he passed away in, would even have heard of K L Gauba's passing. The only person who did notice the significance of his death was Khushwant Singh. And Khushwant Singh wrote an obituary for Gauba, which says that in a different era, K L Gauba's cortege would have been followed by half the city of Lahore. Last week, he did not even have a dozen to mourn his departure. Khushwant Singh happened also to have been K L Gauba's junior when Gauba was a practicing lawyer and when Khushwant Singh had started his career. Khushwant Singh adds that if 50 years ago, if Gauba's name had appeared as a question in a general knowledge exam paper, if 50 years ago Gauba's name had appeared as a question in a general knowledge exam paper, almost every candidate would have got the right answer. 40 years later, Gauba's death happens, and you can safely assume by then that very few people today, including lawyers, legal scholars, historians, if asked about who K L Gauba is, would know anything about him. So what is it about this maverick lawyer, writer, politician, cantankerous litigator that interests you? It's primarily his contribution to the creation of a genre in India, which is the lurid legal thriller. Singh writes rather movingly about the last days of Gauba, where he says, in his later days, K L could be seen in his sola topi and tattered clothes, shuffling around Flora Fountain towards the Asiatic society where he spent his days, reading magazines and sleeping in armchairs. The last time I saw him, he was sitting on the pavement outside a Parsi fire temple, munching parched gram out of a paper cup. It was a pathetic sight. The story literally of from the log cabin to the White House in reverse. So from a palatial Punjab mansion to the pavement of Hirosha Mehta Road. What is unclear both in Gauba's own writings, in his autobiography, as well as in the notes that he's left behind in Nehru Memorial, or his oral transcripts, were the reasons for his financial downfall and why he ended up dying in relative penury. Cushman claims that Gauba turned to writing books as a way of making ends meet after his practice had declined. And while this may be partially accurate, I think it's certainly not the reason for him becoming a writer, since he'd already been a prolific writer from the late 1920s onwards and had written 6 books before he even moved to India. In the aftermath of the partition, when he moves to India, that's when he ends up writing a lot more prolifically. But as a student in Cambridge, Gauba had already harbored desires of becoming a writer. He shot to fame with a book written in 1929, which was Uncle Sham, a response to Catherine Mayo's infamous Mother India. Mother India, as many of the historians here would know, was a scurrilous Orientalist text depicting in a way the sexual excesses of the native population. And Gauba, in a very typical Gauba manner, says that Catherine Mayo spent only 6 weeks in India and wrote Mother India. I'm going to write a book about Uncle Sham without ever having been to the US, and which he proceeds to do, right? So the success of Mother India was such that it actually enabled Gauba to buy a luxurious bungalow in Lahore. But by the time that he had died, Gauba had written over 21 books, traversing this eclectic range: a biography of Prophet Muhammad, a book on the assassination of Gandhi, a study of Muslim minorities in post-partition India. He even contributed a scholarly article to the Supreme Court Journal in the All India Reporter on fundamental rights and the Constitution, and focusing on the ongoing dispute around amendments, etc. But the books which are of interest to me are the ones that you see on the screen, which are basically his legal thrillers: Famous Trials for Love and Murder, The Pakistani Spy and Other Famous Trials, Shameen Rahmani's Case and Other Famous Trials, Meena Tandon's Honeymoon and Other Noted Cases of Marriage and Divorce, The Mystery of the Nagarwala Case, etc. Gauba was born in Lahore in 1899, and by his own admissions, with a golden spoon, amidst luxury that very few Indians living in colonial India would have dreamt of. His father, Hari Lal Kishan, was one of the wealthiest industrialists in Lahore and popularly known as Mr. Electricity, because he was responsible for electrifying Lahore. Hari Lal Kishan was an early nascent nationalist, highly influenced by Lala Lajpat Rai, and he goes to Lala Lajpat Rai to ask him what he can do for the nationalist movement. Lala Lajpat Rai says, what you're good at is making money. So don't join politics, become an industrialist. And it's exactly what Hari Lal Kishan does. So amongst other things, he begins the Punjab National Bank. And both father and son were trained in Cambridge. Their relationship was a very turbulent one, exacerbated by the fact that, K L Gauba, born as Shoshana Lal Gauba, converts in 1933 to Islam, changes his name from Kanhaya Lal to Khalid Latif, retaining his individuals but never really using his name. Now, despite the conflict between father and son, they later found themselves in jail together. So Hari Lal Kishan was sentenced to imprisonment for contempt of court, and that led to his son writing again another scurrilous attack on the Chief Justice of Lahore, Sir Douglas Young, which then he was imprisoned for. So father and son then are in jail together. And it's in his time in jail that K L Gauba really gets interested in writing about the margins of the law. K L Gauba also has the last laugh because eventually the Chief Justice had to resign. But it's in his time in jail that he begins to write begins to think about the popular accounts of legal trials. And in 1946, when he writes his first book on famous trials of love and murder, he says, "In the ample leisure that followed my conviction for contempt of court, I found time to analyze some of the famous trials of the past. I also found plenty of opportunities in the Lahore Central Jail to make psychological cross-sections of some of the more interesting of my fellow prisoners. The result was a number of unconnected notes and stories of trials, some related to political movements, some related to public officials, and most to the more human and, of course, more interesting aspects of crime, namely love and murder." His sentiment seems to echo another writer who clearly influenced him, Edgar Luce Gardner, who was a popular writer of legal trials, and who described trials as emanating from life, because in them love and hate, greed and jealousy, romance and tragedy stand revealed with an intensity that belongs only to real life. So what does Gauba do? Gauba makes good in a way on his ethnographic promise about providing a cross-section of prisoners' lives in a section called Tales from the Central Jail, which are basically personality sketches of different prisoners who he encounters in jail. And while his primary focus remains on adultery and murder, what comes across in Gauba is a sensibility that's devoid of any moral judgment. And instead he displays a very keen alertness to the ordinariness and everyday life of the law. He approaches the question of crime as a matter of ordinary contingency that could visit any person if they happen to be overcome by a moment of indiscretion, passion, or bad judgment. So apprehending the world not as a priori morally ideal space, but rather as one that's an extremely tenuous force field in which good and evil can coexist not as mutually incompatible values, but as shape-shifting happen chances. Gauba's narratives do not foreground the inevitability of evil or crime, but instead depict a world in which an upright person could be motivated to murder as much as a housewife transgressing from sexual fantasy to reality with world-destroying consequences. While seemingly about the sensational and the shocking, I would suggest, and this is my argument, that it's more productive to read Gauba as a chronicler of the legal archive, as a tragic archive. If philosophy and politics foregrounds the idea of reason and rationality as the bedrock of collective life, tragic literature eschews this promise by grounding it in that which is contradictory, precarious, and contingent about our lives. So rather than starting with an abstract idea of a non-contradictory human, for Gauba, the legal archives reveal the human condition to be one that's marked by competing passions, moral dilemmas, and the formidable challenges of what it means to be good. So in his preface to the book on love and murder, Gauba quotes Edmund Burke to say, "The annals of criminal jurisprudence exhibit human nature in a variety of positions, at once the most striking, interesting, and affecting. They present tragedies of real life, often heightened in their effect by the grossness of the injustice and the malignity of the prejudices which accompany them." He then adds that crime is intrinsically interesting, even if the dock has greater appeal to those who are outside of it than those who are within it, arguing that there was something strangely equal about the criminal justice system. Gauba says that in it the poor rub shoulders with the great, just as the anonymous and the illustrious are brought together by punishment. So the persons who follow in the book, Gauba writes, are princesses and ranis, but also persons of little means, nawabs and cooks, members of exalted government service, as also common practitioners, men and women. Revealing what could be termed in a way as his research motivation, Gauba says, in jail one may find interesting stories of crime and punishment, and the daily traffic to and from our prisoners, if analyzed and collated, would yield material both thrilling but also instructive. So what is it about crime that captures his interest? Addressing this question, to my mind, offers an interesting opportunity to explore the genre of the lurid legal thriller beyond its appeal to voyeuristic or sensational curiosity about the crimes of others. Instead, it prompts us to reflect on what genuinely engages or fails to engage our attention. Gauba emphasizes that the most compelling and profoundly human aspects of transgression, which is what attracts us to them, always lies in what we are capable of, love and murder. It's important to note that when he articulates what is of interest, it's not necessarily a personal idea of what is interesting, but as an author, an intuition of what might interest a reading public. By this account, the image of the public sphere that we get from Gauba is far removed from the narrow, one-dimensional, normative ideal of the public sphere advanced by someone like Habermas, with the public defined in terms of its collective investment in deliberative and communicative rationality. Rather, what we find is a public sphere in which reason and irrationality, deliberation and sensation bleed into each other through a doubling of the act of transgression. So there is on the one hand the primary transgression, the subject of the case, and the secondary transgression, which is the audience's recreation of the original transgression as an act of textual enjoyment and pleasure. And we can get a sense of this through one of the cases that Gauba writes about, which is the Fulham Clark murders. And I'm going to come to this in some amount of detail. This is a case which is a major scandal in colonial India. It involved a medical officer in the army having an extramarital affair with another officer's wife, and they conspire to poison the woman's husband and subsequently have the man's wife murdered as well. If you look at the putative afterlife of this case, it's telling of the kind of public that would already have existed for Gauba's books. The Fulham Clark murders were extensively covered in the English language newspapers, both in India as well as in other parts of the colony, with the London Times declaring it to be one of the most remarkable criminal trials in history. David Arnold, in his History of Poisoning in India, observes that the emergence of a print public in the 19th century via a combination of newspaper reports, court cases, and sensationalist literature effectively created a new kind of public for crime. In Arnold's book, the crime of poisoning in particular moves from the purview of science and governance into the realm of imagination, with an emergent Indian public sphere having access for the first time to the intimate lives of Europeans, since poisoning was more often than not an intimate crime rather than one committed by strangers. So this consuming public of toxic tales effectively transforms what would have been a private fear into a public concern that involves the state and the criminal justice system. And Arnold captures this when he says that under colonialism, India's emergent public sphere was no more immune than its Western counterparts to the voyeuristic spectacle of troubled lives, illicit affairs, and poisonous intimacies. So in contrast to the idea of the rational public sphere, I find it more productive to think about the genre circulating within the affective economy of what Mark Seltzer would describe as a pathological public sphere, which is marked by an obsession with violence and its representation. Living as we do in the age of hypermedia, it's relatively easy to identify with this proposition, as it's inconceivable to think of any content in any media platform without narratives of crime and violence, and the kind of rise and the kind of burgeoning of true crime as the most popular genre in recent times is telling of this. But despite Seltzer's invocation of the idea of a pathological public sphere, Seltzer himself self-consciously avoids a pathologization of this phenomenon and deploys it instead as a conceptual category to understand the ways that the public comes into being through a spectacle of violated bodies and a wound culture, at the heart of which is a perplexing challenge of how to make sense of ordinary violence. What unites the genre of true crime, detective fiction, and the legal thriller is a tenuous dance between the attraction to the inexplicable on the one hand and a paradoxical desire for things to be made intelligible. I would consequently argue that the existential and philosophical impulse underlying Gauba's strange and weird cases is a counterintuitive pushback against the hubris of reason that underlies much of the theorization of the public sphere. There are indeed more things in heaven and earth, as Hamlet has reminded us, than are dreamt of in philosophy. The world in Gauba's tales reveals itself not as a neat puzzle that is solved by the detective or the judge, but through a primal strangeness of the world that can never be fully explained or resolved. So to give you one example, in an account of the murder of Shamshad Bai, Gauba narrates the story of the obsession of Nawab Muhammad Nawaz Khan of Dab Kalan with a young dancing girl who was also his mistress. After spending a night with the Nawab, the girl was found dead, with the Nawab lying devastated and forlorn next to her corpse right through the night. The Nawab was charged with her murder, and while his legal team staged an elaborate and convoluted defense, it was relatively clear to everyone, including Gauba, that the Nawab had indeed shot his paramour. Given that his legal defense entailed a denial of this fact, the question of why he did it would always remain the subject of speculation and conjecture. But what is striking about Gauba's reconstruction of the case is his emphasis on the curious and strangeness of the Nawab sleeping next to the corpse. Was this a fact that was relevant to the case? Did it make a difference to the trial? Did it establish the prima facie guilt or innocence of the Nawab? Does it remain a slightly enigmatic puzzle that escapes any search for a rational account? Laura Marx, in her work on information politics, distinguishes between information and the image to argue that while information unfolds to truth and falsity, images, on the other hand, unfold enigmatically. That is, they serve as an event or an artifact of bewilderment. An examination of Gauba's choice of cases that he writes about reveals that what he finds interesting is precisely what remains enigmatic. And he's drawn to those cases that on first glance appears to be strange or weird, considered from the relatively unreliable standards of what one would count as normalcy. So this idea of the case is ubiquitous across various disciplines and professional practices, but as a concept, it's less obvious than it appears to be. Most frequently deployed in fields as diverse as law, medicine, psychiatry, and business, the idea of a case study reveals a dual nature. On the one hand, the case serves as an absolute exemplar, representing a unique circumstance or a problem derived from life. On the other, it transcends its immediate context to become a unit or a wider body of knowledge or theoretical framework. And this dual nature, bridging the particular with the universal, imparts a unique resonance to the case. So Laurent Ballon argues that a case is something that hovers between the singular, the general, and the normative. The fact that forms the basis of the case are the singular event, but events by themselves are not necessarily memorialized in public archives. It is by becoming a legal case that the singularity of the event connects with the generality of the normative order, even as it pierces through the self-sustaining myths of such an order. These cases, when rendered into a narrative for public consumption, creates a rupture in the ordinary, and their reception requires readers to consider not just the individual status of these cases as an exception, but invite the reader to consider the inherent strangeness of the world to which they belong. Gauba, in his commentary on the Khan case that I've just mentioned, observes that, astounding as the facts may appear, truth is often stranger than fiction, and never more so when concerned with the administration of justice. The word strange makes several appearances in the writings of Gauba. To give you examples, Abdul Karim unfolded his strange story. It was strange that if she was not jealous of Gautam's wife and his love for his wife and children, how could she be so insanely jealous, as alleged at the trial, as to murder him after a minor incident? And the word strange keeps recurring. And it's worth considering here what kind of conceptual work the category of strangeness does. Strangeness is first and foremost the name of a very particular affect, as well as a mode and mood of perception. It references a feeling of something amiss or an uncanniness of the ordinary. The idea of the uncanny, as many of us know, comes to us from Freud's idea of the unheimlich, which was literally the unhomely, or not being at home. Strangeness by this account is not a description of something which is unknown and therefore causes us anxiety. For that, the terms horror and terror would be more appropriate. Rather, strangeness attempts to name the familiar being rendered unfamiliar. But these are not necessarily individual affects alone. And the form that Gauba deploys, the compendium of strange cases, renders the familiar worlds of law and justice a little unfamiliar. The image of law that emerges is not one of a smooth surface in which abstract principles intersect with concrete cases and miraculously produce reasoned judgments. Instead, what we witness is a messy entanglement of bodily excesses, emotional turbulence, and the radical uncertainty and contingency that the law struggles to transcend. It's therefore worth considering the relationship of law with sensation and strangeness, because they seem to operate through what John Jervis would describe as circuits of sensation, where strange and unusual facts produce a moral melodrama within the legal courtroom. The operational logic of such a circuit of sensation relies on a curious paradox where law is law, insofar as it is mediated sensation, and sensation is sensation, insofar as it is mediated by the law. Or as Seltzer would say, the world of interiors, bodies, and acts are converted into communication, and the inside is brought outside through an entanglement of the violence media complex. So the sensational event is one where ordinary affects are intensified by the strangeness of facts that emerge from the ordinary, even as they escape the normal attributes of the ordinary, challenging the conventional paradigms of interpretation. And you see evidence of this in Gauba's account of the Shamshad Bhai case. He says, a fully loaded rifle was found near the fireplace, as also another loaded pistol in a suitcase. Two small tables were near the head of the bed. The arrival of the police made little difference to Mohammed Nawaz, for he continued to lie with the corpse of the little dancer. So the dramatic build-up to the strangeness of the story is accentuated by the details, both usual and unusual. It's perfectly normal for two small tables to be near the head of a table. And in the context of the rich Nawab's home, it might be even usual for a fully loaded rifle to be found near a fireplace. But is it usual for a loaded pistol to be found in a suitcase? Now these little details become the red herring for what is revealed as the most unusual aspect of the case, namely that the Nawab continued to lie with the corpse of the dancer. For then we move from the domain of the act as fact to the realm of pure affect. Was he mourning her passing? Was he overcome with grief tinged with guilt? Was he a pervert? How will we ever know? That these questions are not merely questions asked around the motivation and psychology of an individual, but are instead public scripts written and read and interpreted by an interpretative community that transform them from the realm of the personal into the public. Sociologists of law have always reminded us that legal affairs provide us with a particular mode of apprehending the world, much as other disciplines and practices, such as sociology and fiction do. The question, though, is whether in presenting the world through the prism of strangeness, does the law function in a way that brings it closer to fiction and as an apprehension of reality than sociology? What is real in terms of facts become a little less apparent, and by shrouding themselves within the cloak of secrecy and incomprehension, the legal fact itself becomes something that isn't available as self-evident reality, but whose hidden character may nonetheless reveal something that is real in a more profound sense of the term. So if one turns back to Mark Seltzer's theorization of the idea of true crime, Seltzer argues that true crime is crime fact that looks like crime fiction. This proposition uses an interesting logical inversion in an interesting and playful manner to suggest that the lines between the real and fictive turn out to be a little more blurred than is normally presumed, and accordingly it may sometimes require us to don the hat of a fiction writer to be able to more accurately capture something about the real that exceeds in a way any kind of realism or realistic account of reality. And on that count, Gauba is both more than and less than a legal historian. His narrative reconstruction of cases are based very much on publicly documented facts, even as they are shaped by the inherent interest in the strangeness of these facts. It alerts us to the undeniable fact that stories of crime and law exist within a highly mediatized environment in which mass media often serves as an infrastructure through which the world is made accessible to us. This textual doubling of the world becomes a site through which events, facts, and sensation undergo a process of fictionalization, and what Seltzer maintains for true crime is equally true of the fictionalized legal case, that it is premised on an active doubling that returns us to the scene of crime and invites us in as participants of a forensic jouissance. Joseph Hoffman argues that courtrooms have a particularly privileged vantage point as the producers of such a jouissance. He says, driving forces that usually remain hidden from the observer of everyday life emerge visibly in those situations in which life, freedom, and property are threatened, and the judge is able to look deeply into the human heart. In contrast to fiction, that often leaves us unsatisfied about the ultimate causes of an event or the motives of a protagonist, the criminal justice system unveils the innermost thoughts and brings to light the most secret web of deceit. And he proposes that the real pleasure of crime fiction arises not from a fascination for murder and violence, nor even out of the establishment of order, but from the fact that this genre provides us with the purest pleasure of conjecture. In short, true crime is about what truth looks like, what belief looks like, and what relations, intimate and collective, look like in a mass public wound culture that is at once its banality and popularity. So, having established generally what is philosophically interesting about the genre, and also specifically about Gauba's own contribution, let me turn to a closer examination of a few cases that Gauba documents. And I've selected these, there are so many of them, I'm only taking like literally one or two of them, for the proximities that they share with each other, but also a way of contrasting the nature of the colonial public sphere with its post-colonial avatar. I've already mentioned the Fulham Clark murder case, and it's time to revisit this case in greater detail. Gauba was not the first person to write about this case. In 1929, Cecil Walsh wrote a book titled The Agra Double Murder, A Crime of Passion from the Raj, which was based on the letters that were unearthed in the investigation of this case and served to determine the guilt of the two lovers accused of murdering their spouses. Basically, Edward Fulham a deputy controller of military accounts stationed in Meerut, was married to Agatha Fulham, a woman 8 years younger than him. In 1909, Lieutenant Clark, a doctor with the Indian Medical Service, moves to Meerut along with his wife. The two couples quickly become friends, and despite Clark's transfer to Delhi, he finds many reasons and excuses to come to Meerut because by this time he was in a passionate love affair with Mrs. Fulham. In June 1911, Lieutenant Clark falls ill, and for the next few months continuously remains ill as a result of what doctors diagnosed to be heat stroke. One of the doctors, as people would later find out, who happened to oversee his medical treatment was none other than Lieutenant Clark. So on October 10, 1911, Fulham finally dies from a very severe case of heat stroke. There was very little suspicion. There was not even a police complaint that was filed because it was relatively common for Englishmen to succumb to heat stroke. And in the same year, for example, there were already 60 cases of heat stroke that people had died of. A year later, on 17th November 1912, thieves allegedly broke into Lieutenant Clark's house while he was traveling, and they killed his wife. The fact that none of the children were harmed, nor were there any valuables stolen from the house, raised the suspicion of the police for the first time, and they started investigating Clark as a potential suspect. By this time, his relationship with Agatha Fulham was also relatively common knowledge, but there seemed to be very little evidence that linked her in any manner to the murder. That is, until they decided to do a last-minute search of her house, where they stumbled upon a dispatch box hidden under her bed, containing 400 love letters written by her to Lieutenant Clark. These letters formed the basis of the prosecution's case and clearly established a chain of events that led to proving not just a conspiracy to murder Clark, Mrs. Clark, but also revealed that Fulham had been murdered by his wife and her lover. Fulham had been slowly poisoned by her husband using arsenic, by his wife using arsenic, which was supplied by Dr. Clark, and the dosage was closely supervised by him through the letters to each other. Despite Clark's best attempts at protecting Agatha Fulham during the trial, both were found guilty. While Clark was sentenced to death, Mrs. Fulham was sentenced to an imprisonment for life for turning a prover, for the state during the trial. But in an ironic twist worthy of an epic drama of poetic justice, Augusta Fulham died in jail in 1914 from heat stroke. The scandal of the double murder lived on far beyond its protagonists. And as already observed, the trial was covered in all of the English media, not just in India, but also in other parts of the colony. There was, of course, numerous aspects of the case that interested the reading public. Mrs. Clark emerged in her letters as someone who was extremely articulate, well-read, and steeped in romantic fiction, recalling other similar cases from England, as well as from the world of literature such as Emma Bovary. Undoubtedly, the most striking aspect of the case emerged less in its forensic quality in terms of the investigation, as it did through the self-incriminatory letters written by Fulham. The use of the letters as evidence, and consequently as public documents, reveals the fraught and tenuous compact that exists between the public and the private sphere. It's in the criminal trial that really, in a way, the letters come into public glare. What would otherwise have been secrets, confessions, and conspiracies, safeguarded by an epistolary compact, now becomes a matter of public scandal, speculation, and judgment. That the murder involved two respectable European families made the trial all the more attractive for the native population. This was an era in which the public and the private divide was strictly maintained on the basis of colonial difference. Colonial rule had been predicated on an absolute rewriting of the domain of the social, and many practices that were considered to be a part of the realm of the private had been irreversibly breached through colonial intervention. The domain of religion, family, property, ritual, belief, all of this we know had been subject to colonial scrutiny and often reformed in a way that made the private lives of colonial subjects extremely susceptible to being rendered public. This was in sharp contrast with the careful manner in which the private lives of the British were safeguarded in the Indian context. So the colonial gaze had primarily been a one-way street in which native practices and customs were studied, scrutinized, and classified and regulated. One of the rare arenas in which one could witness a reversal of the colonial gaze was in the domain of the legal trial. If it was only the British who could occupy the position of the universal subject, legal trials of the Britishers in India allowed the native subject an opportunity to occupy the position of the universal subject. In the context of the Fulham Clark murder case, this is most clearly evidenced by Colonel Cecil Walsh's description of the unique social status enjoyed by colonial officers and their families. Walsh asks, how does one understand the relatively lax investigation that took place after the first death, that of Mrs. Fulham? Despite the fact that many people knew about the affair between his wife and Clark, Walsh attributes this to the peculiarity of the everyday life of the English in colonial India. He says, there are aspects of the story which may seem strange to readers who are not acquainted with the mode of life in India of the class to which the Fulhams and Clarks belong. People in a big station in the Mufuzil country district are divided into several small social circles or cliques. Given the absolute minority status in numerical terms, he suggests that British families zealously guarded their privacy against the prying eyes of the native subjects. And I quote, on the one hand, life in the bungalow is more exposed to the eyes of neighbours and to outside observation than domestic life in England. The number of servants employed in every household, and the constant changes which take place, especially in the lower ranks of society, and official circles where there are many transfers, and also the ways in which Indian servants have of talking about the home life of the sahibs, amongst whom they work, combine to create a constant flow of gossip. Much of it is deliberately false, and it so often deals with the question of the relation of the sexes, the comparative freedom and independence of women in English society being foreign to Indian ideas and traditions, and little understood that ugly rumors and slanderous gossip are often discounted, if not wholly discredited, when they reach the ears of the Europeans. Within the ambit of their own small circle, the members of each are quizzical enough about the conduct of their neighbours. The passage of Cecil Walsh displays an immense anxiety on the part of the British with regard to the privacy of their domestic lives, and a scandal like the Fulham murder only accentuated many of their fears. The Indian public sphere by the 1920s had already come of age, and the multiple media forms that existed by way of print media, a burgeoning film industry, popular print bazaar culture, fed itself vicariously on scandals. And if it involved sex and murder, then there was nothing better for a young female media. The Fulham case was also of particular interest because it involved poisoning as a form of killing. David Arnold, who I've quoted before, speaking about poisoning in the colonial period, argues that domesticity and poison were intimately connected because more often than not, it was members of the family, lovers, servants, or doctors who were most frequently implicated in poisoning cases. Poison also moved away from being a concern of criminal investigation and forensic science into the realm of popular culture, traversing the space of the private into the public. Citing the work of Anne Stoller on the crisis of intimacy caused by the close relationship between Europeans and their native servants, Arnold suggests that some of these might have to do with the fear of poisoning. Describing poisoning as a betrayal of intimacy, Arnold says that the intertwined language of sexual betrayal and poison often reference each other. So sensational cases like the Agra murder case in a way became a quest for meaning, where they gained their emotional force and social traction from the ways in which they kind of use the terrain of the private sphere and the domestic space of the home to purvey morally edifying and politically empowering stories about public morality and personal vice. The rise of the daily press in England, in India's regional languages, the publication of popular accounts, all of these collectively in a way created a dramaturgy where the public and the private were constantly kind of being blurred. And in 1911, the same year that the Fulham murder case happens, Gauba writes about another case that takes place in 1911, which is the Rani Bhagwan Kaur poisoning case. Rani Bhagwan Kaur goes to Haridwar, where she falls in love with some kind of a sadhu. But by the time she returns back to Punjab, her love kind of wanes, whereas his passion is only increased. And he begins to write her these extremely amorous, erotic love letters, threatening to kill himself, etc., all which created a bit of a public crisis for the Rani back in Punjab. So she eventually invites him over as some kind of a conciliatory gesture. And needless to say, within a couple of days, he also dies of heat stroke. So the cause of the heat stroke turns out to be the same. It's arsenic poisoning. Not long after the Fulham murder case and the Rani Bhagwan Kaur case, K L Gauba talks about another case, which is the Amendra Chandra Pandey case, a rich Bengali zamindar who dies of bubonic plague. But as it turns out, his brother had hired the services of a doctor who with considerable difficulty manages to obtain from Arthur Road Infectious Diseases Hospital in Bombay a sample which contained cultures of the bubonic plague. This was then inserted into a hypodermic injection, and a person was hired to prick Amendra Chandra Pandey on a busy street in Calcutta. Right? The Poisons Act had been passed in 1904 and had been in fact passed to outlaw the unregulated sale of poison in India. So this is a time where this entire question of the toxic begins to move as both a literal object as well as a metaphorical object, circulating between the realms of the forensic laboratory, the courtroom, and of course a nascent public sphere of media. Not very different from today's toxic media times. So while Gauba believed himself to be a chronicler both of the Nawab as well as of the cook, both of the rich and the poor, he does spend a considerably amount of time on the criminal lives of the rich and the powerful, more than he does on the poor. Like many other Indians, he had a particular fascination for what he saw as the scandalous deeds of the Maharaja and the Nawabs. And interestingly, one of his earliest books, written in 1932, was a book called His Highness. Again, a scathing attack on the debauchery of Indian Maharajas and Nawabs, created as much from history as from Gauba's wild imagination. His books on popular legal trials are densely populated by accounts of conspiracy and murders by members of the aristocracy. What are we to make of this obsession of his, and presumably his audience? Was it just an expression of a jealous ressentiment, particularly at a time when India was marked by an extremely sharp inequalities and poverty? Or is there something more to this obsession which is perhaps related to a similar obsession that we saw with respect to the slightly voyeuristic interest that the Indian reading public had about the interior lives of Europeans? How does this translate in the context of post-colonial India? It's my contention that Gauba's interest in the criminal lives of royalty has to be understood in terms of a continuation of an interest in the private lives of those that are perceived to be impossible to reach. In the colonial context, this included ordinary Europeans as well as extraordinarily rich and powerful Indians. And in the post-colonial context, of course, it dovetails into an obsession with celebrity culture. Numerous examples from recent times, from Sushant Singh Rajput's suicide to the arrest of Aryan Khan in a drug case that seems to testify to an unholy mix of press, publicity, and prurient passions. And there's something strangely disjunctive about the idea of a public sphere that we all belong to, even if you do not have access to. Our obsession in recent times with the multiple weddings of the Ambanis is a good instance of this. Much like the imaginary space of citizenship in which people are inscribed as equal citizens, even as most people are constantly reminded of the vast chasm that exists between them and the rich and the powerful, there is a manner in which this idea of the consuming public, of interiorities, of the lives of people who are otherwise unavailable to us, creates a certain idea and a unique idea of the wound culture that Seltzer talks about. John Davis submits that one way of making sense of this is to understand the role that affective networks and circuits of sensation play in mediating between tensions of belonging and not belonging. He argues that individuals are both a part of abstract collectives, even as they exist absolutely apart from them. One of the ways in which people are able to transcend their embodied social realities are through forging affective ties in the form of passionate investment in the lives of those who live totally apart from them. At the highest level, of course, there is the nation and the interpretation of a collective community. But on a more quotidian plane, celebrity culture, especially in the form of mass media personalities, from film stars and sportspersons, play the role of maintaining the mass public's relationship to the idea of a body. And in this case, a body that is a wounded body. So reading Gauba in that sense is presciently rewarding for what he reveals to us about the contemporary situation of media and celebrity culture. There is much about Gauba that I have to say, but I know that I also want to leave time for a discussion. So I'll turn to my conclusion. On the 1st of July 2018, 11 members of a family were found dead in Burad, a neighborhood in Delhi. 10 were found hanging, while the oldest, the grandmother, had been strangled to death. Following the discovery of the bodies, the entire city and country, shocked by what happened to the seemingly stable, ordinary middle-class family in Delhi. The media swiftly swarmed the crime scene like vultures, advancing various theories even before the police had initiated a thorough investigation. Social media, along with print media and electronic outlets, buzzed with speculations ranging from mass murder to conspiracy theories involving disturbed family members and sexual compacts. It turned out in reality, when the narrative unfolded, that that the reason or the underlying reason in the case turned out to be much stranger than fiction. Contrary to the speculation, the events unraveled as a mass suicide committed for occult reasons. The patriarch at the head of the family, who had died a few years ago, had become a very influential figure in the family. And after his death, one of his sons claimed that the spirit of his father had taken possession of him and was giving him instructions written out in detail in diaries. The police found 11 diaries which detailed and outlined the method by which the family members were to be reunited with their deceased father. The most persistent word used in the media to describe the Burani mass suicide was the word tragedy. It is about as accurate as it can get. But the trouble with words is that we often use them as if they were self-explanatory. What indeed do we mean when we describe such an event as a tragedy? Earlier in the paper, I had suggested that it would be productive to read Gauba against the grain, not as a chronicler of the lurid alone, but as someone who is also attuned to the contingency and tragedy of law. Living as we do in a time when crime and criminal forensic imaginaries dominate so much of our public lives, it may be tempting to dismiss the entire genre of true crime and legal thrillers as spectatorial voyeurism, worthy of denouement. And indeed, if we look at the nature and content of a majority of TV shows, media reportage and social media discourse around true crime, it's difficult not to feel a certain repulsion at the intent and the objective of these depictions. But following Roland Barthes, we should remind ourselves that texts are not merely a product of a writerly intention, but also of a readerly intent. And on that count, we can either bemoan the fact that the public sphere seems to be reduced to collectives of debased gawkers, or we take seriously the complicated nature of this collective interest, often lurid, occasionally profound, but always perplexed. In choosing to recover the tragic possibilities of a writer like K L Gauba, I propose to take the latter route. Encounters with accounts of crime, especially those that challenge our comfortable frames of reference, can produce a range of affective responses. The lurid is merely one of the many diverse affects that are engendered by these narratives. The tragic is the name of another. For in tragedy, we have to make sense of a phenomenon that appears strange and inexplicable in ways that move beyond moral psychologizing, which reduce the world into neat divisions of good and evil, and instead invites us to think about what it means to think about agency, misfortune, moral failure, and bewilderment in the face of crime and violence. We normally think of the effects of the criminal justice either as the just rewards meted out to the deserving, or sometimes as an unfair and loaded institution that distributes its punishment unequally on the basis of class and social identity. Adopting a law and literature approach to the genre of the true crime legal thriller, I argue, allows us to think about law, justice, and crime with all of its moral and political ambivalences. If the criminal justice can sometimes, like tragedy, be understood as a misfortune that befalls someone, then at other times, it's also a misfortune that individuals have a role in shaping. And to revisit the words of Edmund Burke, the annals of criminal jurisprudence are striking because they exhibit human nature as a tragedy of real life in all of their myriad possibilities. Thank you. I'll stop with this.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. I am truly impressed by the wide swathe that you have brought in your paper, which is from looking at Gauba in its own context, but also to look at this, to look at the afterlife of this idea of the lurid in the legal fiction, right? And to think about the contemporary context as to how we are, in some ways, still within that, operating in that realm of narrativization of the lurid as it is taking place. There are, particularly, when we're thinking about what's happening to the late colonial and the post-colonial state, the way in which law, public life, print, all these factors are, determining the way in which the relationship between individuals, law, society, all are going to be configured. It is a fantastic presentation. I'm certain everybody is so much to. I just, thinking about this question, this idea. Do you want water?
No, I have to.
Yeah. So this idea of the narrative public, which is getting created in multiple ways at that point of time. And Gauba's books are, I assume, mostly in English. I've only seen all in English. But of course, I mean, as you point out, there's also similar kinds of accounts that are coming out. Probably not so detailed, but the interest in the Lurid is always there. So in other languages, I'm also thinking of the early, part of the 20th century. Literacy levels are still low. So there's also, some kind of a public interest and public reading of perhaps these accounts, right? Which is creating not just the singular reading as we engage in, but also people engaging, reading together at that point of time, listening to the accounts, right? So in that sense, how much of this formation of the narrative public as it is emerging is also in terms of the public, and you very clearly point out that the public that we are looking at one level, of course, it is the English reading public, but at the other level, it's also people who are probably kind of reading newspapers from the boards where they are, pasted. How much this question of empowerment as it comes vis-a-vis through the Lurid, vis-a-vis the lives of others, how much does it, as we see today in the case of the social media, it is a highly empowering position from where the public interacts, and that also in some senses makes the very prosaic law case, right, into something which turns into, as you point out, spectacle. Right? So I was thinking in terms of these kinds of power equations that emerge, but this is only a thought. I think we should just open it out. There are other people.
Yes, also people, those are online.
And there are people online, and maybe then you can, kind of think about ways of combining rather than.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes. Please. And please raise your hand so that
I have a very simple question. Did Gauba ever write about the cases he fought in the court? That's one. The second, do you have any idea that what kind of cases he was taking or fighting in the courts?
Any other questions from there? Anything? Yes, Raj.
I have not a very well-formed question, but we talk about this with the Lurid and so the other side of this kinds of narrative is that it is we know the story only because they have been apprehended and punished. So it is like the postman always wins twice. There is this inevitability of justice being done. At another level, it is like the Edgar Allan Poe story, and the Lacan's comment.
The letter always
reaches its destination. So that kind of a self-fulfilling destiny, is it the interest of the story, or is it the lurid and the strangeness, as you said, and the weirdness, whatever, the abnormal? Is that the interest, or the interest is in the inevitability of law, whatever, and the destination, that it always just trying to be found out and find it. Is that the interest?
Also, in a number of these cases, I was looking up because, the Shoshana Felman case, for example, and she gets some 2 years or some such thing, and then goes on to live the rest of her life in Delhi right? In terms of what Rajan is pointing out, the inevitability of a certain kind of conclusion, how does the public then respond to the outcome of the case itself? Yeah, Bindu.
The legal thrillers from the West. I don't know whether that Perry Mason is a legal thriller at all.
Very much.
It is.
But that genre is very much about cracking the evidentiary. And it is a production of a rational subject or something which one can find it.
Education would be more PI, not so much legal, but of course, as long as it's police procedural, there are.
Yeah.
It is about the cleverness of the lawyer who manages to get that and it's legal.
Courtroom drama.
Courtroom drama.
I'm just wondering whether something about what is that, the situation of the native or something like that comes in this luridness with which these cases are. It's not the rational, no. This is actually the spectacular and the.
Yeah, and just to connect, I mean, it's not again a fully thought out question. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the co-production, in a certain sense, of like the law as a kind of public sphere activity and popular cultural forms of such as fiction, film, and today like social media trials.
Can I just
Yes.
take some of these together?
Yes,
There are
yes,
quite a few
yes.
of them. You're entering slightly dangerous terrain because my doctoral work was on law and popular cinema. So I have a book coming out called Objection, My Lord, which makes the argument about how the representation of law and cinema in India is actually very different from what you see in the Western context. And I'll try to bring these together. First, a clarificatory answer to Professor Dangwal's question. Gauba indeed writes a lot about the cases that he is himself a participant in. So even in some of these accounts, he's writing about his own cases. And he is, in the best sense of the ethnographic researcher, he believes in participatory observation. He has affairs with some of the women that are involved in these matters. It's very dramatic. I mean, so the ordinary.
There was no ethical code of conduct.
No. It was a much easier time. So in a way, the kind of the plainness of his death is the irony, because the colorfulness of his life is incredible. So he has an autobiography called My Friends and Foes, and he also has around 6 to 8 hours of an older transcript left in the Nehru Memorial, where he talks about his own cases. So what is striking about why he failed as a lawyer and why he moved to penury is surprising, because he was also senior counsel. So it wasn't that he was just an ordinary lawyer, and he's remarkably sharp legally. I mean, you can actually rely on a large number of his accounts of these cases for their legal analysis as much as you can for their literary flourish, right? So that's something which is unique about him. But yes, you can see a shift in the mode of his writing. When he begins to focus much more on these, the sensational cases at a later point in time in his career. So to try to weave together, a set of questions which have overlapping concerns, I would say that what Tanuja has raised is in some ways, how do we imagine the pedagogic impulse of modernity as we know it in terms of the production of the colonial subject? Not merely as a subject of power, but as a subject of pedagogic transformation. The role of law, of course, was crucial to that. And the institution of the courtroom, as a public institution of reason, was one of these sites that was seen to be, a site of immense investment in the production of a new rational subject. And yet at the same time, there is an inherent tension that kind of exists between the nature of the cases that are coming in and the public sphere that is not looking at these cases for their pedagogic value as much as for their sensational value. And that is a tension that's very clearly there, right? If the courtroom was supposed to be a site for the learning of reason and the production of this kind of new subject of rationality, the reading public was learning something else altogether. So there is one case which Gauba writes about, which is a very dramatic case, which is the Abdul Bawla murder case that happens in the 1920s, where basically it brought down, it brought down a Maharaja. So this was as big as it got. Because basically, a Maharaja who was basically, and it's not any small, princely kingdom. We're talking about, the Maharaja of Baroda, who had an affair and had a mistress, who runs away from his his harem after he forces her to have an abortion, and he sends across a team to kill her in Bombay, where they track her. And as this team is attempting, to kidnap her, because by then she's having an affair with the mayor of Bombay, Abdul Bawla, and his mistress. While they're attempting to kidnap him from Bawla, a group of English officers heading out of one of the clubs playing golf sees them, and they jump out of their cars with their golf clubs and go and rescue him. Bawla is murdered, right? He's shot. Now this case became a huge sensational trial because Jinnah was involved in the defense, etc. And there were hordes of people who followed the case. There were allegedly tickets sold for the hearings that were happening, right, in the trial. So you have this kind of a hyper-sensationalized kind of a case. And of course, like you mentioned of the other thing, after the case was over, the Mumtaz Begum, the mistress in question, enters Hindi cinema to become an actress. She fails, but she actually goes to Hollywood to join the film industry there. So the transaction that seems to be happening happens at 2 or 3 different registers. There is a transaction that's happening at the level of technology and medium. So there is a movement that is happening between print media on the one hand, literacy, as well as mass media by way of cinema. There is also a transaction that's happening by way of characters and individuals who are moving between the worlds of glamour, of public life, as well as of law. Right? So a lot of these lawyers are actually, similar to today's time, moving across these registers. And finally, there is a movement that's happening at the register really between the domain of the impersonalized domain of pedagogical impulses, of a nascent kind of nationalist public sphere, as well as of an affectively kind of charged excessive public sphere. And this heady mix all coming together, I think, is what makes this entire domain really, really kind of fascinating. Because in many ways, if one were to think about the idea of what the relationship between sensation and sensibility is, in the quest for law's desire to become, the arbiter of what it means to be modern, here is a complicated account that emerges. And I think that the post-colonial reminiscences of this really survives in the cinematic representations. So a lot of the legal thrillers in the Western context, as you know, emerges from the roots within the idea of the genre of detective fiction, which is the privileging of rationality over superstition, the uncovering. The denouement is the denouement of rationality, right? It's the laboratory that emerges as the hero, the scientific evidence that emerges as the hero, etc. In the Indian context, the legal melodramas are much less certain. So the legal melodramas in India become a dramaturgy of a slightly different kind. So if you take films like Avara or B.R. Chopra's Kanhaya, there is a tension embedded in them because they're not necessarily about the triumph in a way of the law over primordial forms of affiliation, kinship networks, etc. They become the site where all of the paradoxes and tensions of kinship, of community, of tradition and modernity actually end up playing out. So one of the forms that it takes, a lot of the legal thrillers in India of that period are really about family recognition dramas. Right? The courtroom becomes a site where there is a belated recognition. So Avara becomes about Justice Raghunath belatedly recognizing his son, who he had disallowed. Kanun becomes all about the suspicion of a son-in-law who's the prosecuting lawyer against his father-in-law, who he suspects to be the thing. The chief witness in the case is the daughter. So this entire entanglement. Parasakti as well. So one argument that could be made is, the pedagogic impulse of the law is rendered in a very different way through what one could be described as a familiarizing of the law, with the pun on the word familiar, right? The familiar and the familiar actually get enmeshed together. On the question of what is actually of interest, is it the lurid or the arrival of the law? I think that question is also closely related to this. or to reframe it in the terms of Lacan's reading of the Edgar Allan Poe story, which is the inevitability of the arrival of the letter. Here I would say that a lot of the texts that you see about the courtroom as a space is actually less about the inevitability of the arrival of justice, which is the ultimate guarantee that the law is supposed to make, as much as it is actually about the inevitability of the non-arrival of the letter. Right? There is something that is missing. There is something that will actually never actually arrive at its destination. And what is that? For me, when I look at the idea of strangeness as opposed to the idea of what is seemingly intelligible to us, the lurid, the voyeuristic, etc. Strangeness is that which is not an account of, it's an account of a lack. The lack remains. And that lack is really something where there is a conjecture that remains. Right? So despite the conclusion that the court may have arrived at, and you see this in today's times as well, right? The court's narrative is only the beginning of conjecture. And that for me is what is interesting about the form and what it does. So yeah. The last question was really in terms of the co-production of law and publicness, which yes, in many ways, this idea of the primary encounter, whether in the colonial period or in the contemporary, for a large number of people, the primary encounter with the law is not with the empirical fact of the law, it's not with the abstract idea of the law as principle, it's with the idea of the law as representation. So there is a doubling that is your first encounter. One of my early interests about why I got interested in law and cinema was actually a conversation with someone when I was interning with a lawyer who was dealing with a custodial torture case, and we were interviewing the client, and he said something very strange. He said that when I was being tortured, I just kept thinking of Kanhaya, the film, where Sunny Deol is being tortured in the police station, and that's how I managed to actually, bear what was happening to me. The second thing that happened was a client came in, very distraught, after she had appeared in court for the first time. This was the first time that she had actually seen a courtroom. When she came back to the office, she said that this is not how it's supposed to be. It's just not how it's supposed to be, right? Because it didn't match with what she had expected through her encounter of the courtroom in cinema. Now, a lot of the Western literature on law and cinema engage in what one would describe as a corrective criticism. The corrective criticism is that they show the gap between the reality of law and the fictional of its representation, and critique the fiction as being a mythologizing of law which has nothing to do with reality. I think in contrast, the approach that is interesting, if one were to think about, let's say, the hyper-fictionalized worlds of the courtroom in India, is not that it is so far away from reality, but precisely that it is so far away from reality that it tells us something interesting about the law. So the very nice statement that Ranveer Samadar says, he says that if you want to learn about, about evidence, you go to, if you want to learn about, I forget the formulation, but broadly it comes down to this, that if you really want to learn about drama, you should go to the law. But if you want to learn about law, you should go to drama.
Yeah. There's Yogesh, Sanjay, and sorry, I forgot your name. Amar. Yeah. So,
And Vinod.
And Vinod.
Two set of questions. One is actually just a query.
And also, if there is anybody online who wants to put a question, either raise your hand or just type it in the box so that we can address it here.
One is that when are these getting published? Are they getting published when his career in Lahore is over? Because the cover seems to be pretty post-1947 kind of covers.
Yeah.
So I was just wanting to understand the relationship between his practice in Lahore and actually his, entry into the world of the crime fiction. So there seems to be a gap between the both. He's probably not writing during the time that he is practicing these in some of these cases. The second question that I had is, would you classify these, because I was curious, and people from literary art and others will want to also might be curious in similar way. Would you classify them as fictions or non-fictions, their work? I'm asking this because is he also using crime thrillers to resolve the cases which he couldn't resolve, right? I'm just wondering if there are cases where he lost and he's using also the thriller as a way to resolve what he really couldn't.
Can I cut in line and ask a very
Yeah.
sort of similar related question? And I've been thinking about the word afterlife, affective afterlife. And of course, these of legal archives, so when these cases are happening, that also involves all of these affects that we've been talking about, sensationalism, straightness, all of that. We are specifically looking at this as a genre question of how these of course, probably, I don't know if it is slightly different from police procedural, even though there are overlaps. This is from the legal side, I suppose. So when affect moves, because that's what it primarily does, how would that be different from when the case is happening and when it is sort of later in its afterlife, when it's sort of formulated in this literary sort of genre?
Shall we again take a few
Yeah,
questions?
yeah, let's do that.
Sanjay and then we do.
We try and sort of people who have been wanting to ask. I just wanted to know, is there anything specifically colonial Indian about this genre of writing? And I say this because it seems to me that law under colonial conditions, and, especially from the late 19th century, print culture and so on, I think for the common subject, I mean, the spectacle of it, I guess, is sort of forms the basis for the sensationalism. Doesn't it have to be about important people, Nanavati? Raymond Saraswati himself was poisoned under suspicious circumstances, and I'm sure a lot was written about it in the late 19th century. I guess within India you have people reading Sherlock Holmes and this whole round of crime thrillers, and subsequently I guess the Arthur Christie literature. So would you place him kind of in that genre, or there is something very specifically, quote unquote, native about this, although he's writing in English? Because we know that in non-English languages, say for instance in Hindi, you have a whole genre of popular literature of crime thrillers, and it continues even now. I recall as a child, Maya and Manohar Kanhaya, that world of crime and so on. Yeah, it's sensational, and I think it's primarily about illegal activities around sexual conduct, property and murder, and it's something which is sort of is this common to the Western trajectory as well? That's
I wrote the question down, so I'll try to read it. So I'm sort of thinking, as much as you say that there is the affective afterlife of the legal archive, at least in today's sort of context, you said that there is a lapse between the law and what happens. But at least in today's context, when you look at things or the way that crime occurs, there might be no law to begin with, and there are these spaces in law where some bodies are not accommodated for, some crimes are maybe not accommodated for. So my sort of question was then, if you were to read or reread, K L Gauba's sort of text today, how would a reader, or let's say from a craft perspective, how would the writer sort of engage with the impossibility of the archive? My first sort of question, and something that comes with it is, I think one text that I'm not really sure about law and crime fiction, but I think one text that I read very close was Janet Malcolm, where she writes the journalist and the murderer, and there is a very constant conviction that the story that has to be said, regardless of the truth or speculation or otherwise, often depends on the kind of story that has to be said by the writer. So you had sort of noted that there is the kind of colonial impulse for the colonial subject to sort of voyeuristically maybe imagine what the person might do when these superstars or whatever, and that kind of. So I'm today also wondering that as much as the ordinary person cannot, or the colonial subject cannot imagine the European's life, do you also think that these kind of narratives also note to the inability of the average individual to understand the register of the affect of legality, and how there is the inability of the very regular person to how they don't fit in with the affective movement of the legal. In that sense, then the legal becomes the kind of it becomes clinical rather than kind of affective. It becomes more about diagnosing. So yeah, I think that's what
there's but I just want to sort of with Sanjay and Amal. So when I'm looking at, say, for example, 18th century Rajasthani archive, and there are a lot of cases that come up, quote unquote, which are about adultery, which are about extramarital relationships. They're also about divorce and all. And there's a certain kind of mundaneness to the way in which they get dealt with, right? Which is about finding and so on. And from there on, when you move to a colonial context, where it just becomes this legal spectacle. I mean, there's nothing spectacle about the fact that somebody is being asked to pay a fine because they have committed adultery, and then kind of pay the fine and move on with life, right? So this is what I was just also trying to think about in the way in which this register is shifting. Yeah, we know.
My question was that in your description of the two stories, I am not reading you're really touching on the strange and also the shifting affect in moments that we commit things where we don't know what we did, but then that has to be explained to the court of law. So I was just wondering, where is this strangeness and this humaneness to commit that, in the justice system as it's trying to explain. So what I'm asking is, what is the innocence that is trying to explain itself through this process? Because it is trying to reach a space where no one has understood.
Yeah.
And I don't know what would be that quality of innocence. So that is one thought. Secondly, the pedagogic question. Just like the Johnny Depp's case, which is like publicly consumed ad infinitum. So usme, as an audience, I'm not looking at the person who committed or the judge, but as an audience, there is something in us where we are voyeuristic, we are compassionate, we are greedy, we also want hell to break loose on the other. It's a very compelling needs. And then we want to be intelligent and also distant and away. But we would like to consume them. So this quality of human, how does it then actually make sense of the scholarship? So what is the plea? What is the connection? What is the empathy there? Right? So you mentioned about the person writing about the margin and the way of getting at the rich and powerful, like one stroke. That was something I got in thing. But I don't know if there are other aspects where it will also teach us to be more human before we judge. Yes.
On the factual clarification about the publishing context, most of these were, many of his books were published by Jacob. They were also Jacob. They were also a part in a way of a large number of other books that were circulating primarily in railway stations, etc. So they were very much in that circuit. They were in the circuit of what we've seen from the 19th century onwards of a certain kind of a print culture in which the criminal imaginary is very crucial. But most of the true crime accounts that existed, the Manohar Kanhaya, kind of thing downwards, where the focus is actually on the procedural. With Gauba, the focus is entirely on the legal. And that's where an interesting kind of a tension arises. Because why am I using the idea of the affective afterlife? I also went to many of the reported judgments of the cases that Gauba writes about. And in those cases, you have a very different world, right? Because there, what is done away with as the first part of any legal judgment, which is the narration of the facts, to then the arguments of the petitioners and the respondents, and then the reasoning of the judges. Classically, what in legal analysis would be described as the FIRAC or IRAC, which is facts, issues, reasoning, arguments, conclusion, or as your classical mode of analysis. The facts are the ones which are actually, in some ways, the least important the moment the judgment has come into being, because that has converted the domain of the fact into the domain of law. And it's this mass archive of facts that the facts don't, that you transcend your status of being an event. You transcend the status of being a fact into becoming a law. To give you an example, a friend of mine who was doing some amount of work on data analysis of ordinary divorce cases finds that there was something like 32,000 judgments only from Maharashtra pertaining to divorce, which routinely use this phrase that a marriage is constituted by mutual love, respect, and affection. Right? 32,000. Everything. So it's almost like this is. So there is a subsumption, what Deleuze would describe as the repetition. So the question is repetition sameness or is repetition difference? And here for me, the idea of what emerges when one looks at the affective afterlife is a case has been resolved and settled. It's re-narrativized by Gauba through a process of writing. And it's in the re-narrativizing that you have this affective excess that finds its way in. And what is interesting about it comes down to the question that you've asked, which is how do we make sense of it? My interest in all of this is really eventually in terms of actually understanding this idea of the tragic archive. Why am I so interested in the idea of the tragedy? For the simple reason that, like Gauba, and himself as a legal subject, suddenly finding himself in jail, the nature of the law is such that it's literally all of us, because we are legal subjects, are also contingently legal subjects. And it's only literally a matter of one slight error, one slight act, one slight judgment that you're suddenly converted from being the contractual law-abiding citizen into becoming the illegal denizen produced before a court of law. And there is something to be said about the non-judgmental and extremely empathetic view with which he looks at the question of murderers, of gangsters, of rapists, everyone. There's a manner in which there is, that there is a distinction that he's able to make between the act and its commission and its circulation within a logic of justice versus the human that remains in the aftermath of the execution of justice. And that's the experience of being in court. So the tragic archive for me is really in some ways a recovery of the presumption that the law presumes in a way a psychic integrity that constitutes the idea of the human, right? That constitutes the idea, which is why it insists on the reasonable man as a standard, right? Did you or did you not act as a reasonable person or a reasonable man? Versus the idea that lives are torn asunder precisely by the fact that there is an unreason in our lives that make us capable of doing things, of acting in ways which are not within the calculus of reason, efficiency, utility, rationality, etc. And there is a way in which then recovering in a way the 32,000 generic ideas of marriage to the fact that each of these constitute a moment. So when you reread the legal archive, you realize that here is one where murder, mayhem, modernity, all of these, it's an archive literally of lives, not merely of principles. It's an archive of fascinating facts and not merely fascinating doctrines. I mean, of course, there's a utility for the latter that my training immediately kind of alerts me to. So there is a conceit of the law that presumes that there is this kind of psychic integrity that it has. And then there is the literary kind of, where there is a tension between law and literature on this precise count. Is this specific to India? I'm not sure of that answer. I think there are overlaps and there's a continuum that you see between, let's say, a similar kind of a reading public, a similar kind of an interest in the English context, where the main emphasis, of course, is on class and not on racial difference. But there is equally, in a way, kind of a difference that emerges. And to my mind, it emerges from the fact that if a lot of detective fiction was grounded, a lot of Sherlock Holmes stories are about someone who returns from the colonies with a mysterious ailment that propels them towards acting in a criminal manner, right? The translation of that, of course, in the post-colonial context really moves into the terrain of class, into the terrain, again, of that which is precisely that which is the native. What is native is not something which is in heaven, but something which is actually the idea of a marker of otherness in the post-colonial context, and that is class. Class becomes a very huge point in which this comes in. The one specific thing which I think is really common and which becomes very crucial is, of course, this question of what is the idea of the public and the private divide mediated by the idea of domesticity and gaze, right? So domesticity which would be otherwise protected, domesticity which is otherwise, whether in terms of the English protection of their own domesticity or what Partho describes as the inner sphere that was not what they colonized, etc. The law renders all of them into public scripts. And it's in rendering them into public scripts that the element of the inexplicable and the strangeness arises, because otherwise it would have been the domain of the secret, right? It's in becoming a public secret that you suddenly now have to deal with 11 people in a middle-class family committing a mass suicide, only occasioned by their becoming public scripts of law. And of course, media is a crucial mediator in how these are then kind of received. And I think in that sense there is both a continuity as well as a rupture that happens. What do we characterize is Gauba's fiction or non-fiction? I think we need a better account. Just like Truman Capote invented a new genre in Cold Blood, where he invented the genre of faction, right? Which was fiction that is written, reality written as fiction. I think faction doesn't quite capture what Gauba is doing. And I think to a certain extent, when I referred Mark Seltzer, when he talks about the true crime being a legal, a crime fact which looks like a crime fiction, it's really a fascinating idea, because what is crime fiction and what is crime fact? And crime fiction has been capable of producing, in a way, the highest of literature, right? So whether it is Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler, has been recognized as providing us insights into the domain of the social, the personal, etc., in very crucial ways, in a way that crime reportage has never been given that status. There is something about it being a crime fact that actually reduces its ability to say something poignant about the human condition in a way that crime fiction elevates that capacity. And I think that with the legal crime thriller, this is an interesting mix. I don't think Gauba achieves it. I think that one can read into Gauba. So the book that you talked about, the Janet Malcolm book, these are ways in which there is a genre in India. It's very underdeveloped. There's a wonderful book called This House of Grief about a murder trial where a father is accused of having killed his two children because of a very acrimonious divorce that is happening. He drives this car into a canal where he survives and the two children die, right? He claims that he had a coughing fit and had a blackout, and that goes in. But that's an account where you really get a sense of what it might mean to actually write about the law and a legal trial in a way that really renders it, into really high philosophical literature. I don't think we have the legal fiction in India yet that does it. There is some amount of legal ethnography, I think, that is, kind of exploring that.
Princely imposed. Princely imposed.
Princely Impostor is a fantastic, account. But again, it exceeds legal fiction in what it does. And one thing which is very curious in Princely Impostor is that, here is an account starting from the trial court all the way to the Privy Council about whether the Baba Sannyasi is an impostor or not. But in the middle of all of that, Partho inserts a chapter which is the identity puzzle, right? Where he goes into this entire philosophical discussion on the nature of identity in time, Derek Parfit, etc., etc. And I think that is what, in some ways, my hopeful or wishful thinking is in wanting to recover and retrieve these archives. So yeah, I mean, the question of is law then, what is the in the contemporary context, you said that is law finally the unknowable, and you also said that there are occasions where there is no law. I think that the idea of a no law is a misnomer. There is always law, even in its absence, right? And there is something then to be said about this idea, and I think the knowability is actually quite crucial. The law is always knowable, right? It publicizes itself through pedagogic kind of processes all the time. It only becomes unknowable when you are produced before it. And who is the person who's captured this most brilliantly? Not a legal theorist, not a legal philosopher, it's Kafka. Kafka's Before the Law is really literally about suddenly being rendered before what is something which is actually mystical. It's beyond the idea of a rational bureaucratic institution that you associate Kafka's world with. It's actually mystical. There is something that becomes almost inexplicable, and in that then arises this question of the mystery. What does it mean to uncover the mystery? Can the mystery then be resolved through a move of rationality like detective fiction would like you to have? Or does it require a ghost story? Becomes the question.
Yes, yes.
I have a very curious
This is
question.
the last question,
Yes.
unless there is somebody in the online audience.
We can't do that.
So I have a curious question with regard to the Gauba's legal thrillers. Does he also involve scientific and forensic investigation, the development which were happening in his thrillers, and how did he take in account in his work, both in the cases and in his book?
Not much. Given my own interest in the idea of the forensic as a perceptive mode of apprehending the world, especially in today's time, where everything is forensic, right? I mean, the public sphere is forensic. When India won the T20 World Cup, understandable jubilation, celebration, etc. But really what lingered on after the victory for weeks on end was a collective investment in the Surya Kumar catch, on whether or not he had stepped across the boundary. So you had the publicly available and publicly viewed, judgment by way of what the Third Empire had concluded. And then you had millions of these videos, photographs, forensic analysis by people who obviously everyone was using their mobile phones. And there was this kind of a forensic excess and just the jouissance of it. So for that reason, I would have absolutely been delighted had Gauba actually also gone into the forensic. But he doesn't. But one can again reconstruct through the reading of really that imaginary that is underlying much of our contemporary. So my interest in Gauba and drawing the line from Gauba to the contemporary is really in the idea of the forensic. So the etymological root of the idea of forensis, which is forms of public making and forms of public truth making, is in many ways both the political conflict of our times, as well as the the source in a way of all kinds of new modes of fantasy, intervention, etc. So if you take the last 10 to 20 years, every case is really about media forensics, right? I mean, it's the hard drive, the mobile phone. In Umar Khalid's case, there is 45,000 pages of evidence. What are these 45,000 pages? Printouts of WhatsApp messages, right? So there is this industry, the forensic industry that is at play. And so even to understand in that sense, the ideology and the ideological work of the forensic imaginary requires us to kind of, make these kind of linkages from them to now.
Can I just ask a question related to this, which is just that, on one hand there is forensics and forensics and forensics. There's also forensic architecture, which is trying to bring
counter-forensic.
bring a certain kind of justice back. But I'm thinking of what's happening in Palestine today.
Yeah.
So endless documentation. But that endless documentation means nothing.
Yeah.
So where are we with, what does it mean in a certain sense? I've been trying to get my head around what this excess of information and this kind of complete disappearance of information mean for us.
As actually the excess of information then actually, has it made information then disappear as a...
So, here, there are two things I want to say. One is what used to be classically the distinction between event and narrative there was a temporal gap that existed between the event and its narrativization. The emergence of the idea of the live through the mobile phone as either in terms of live tweeting or in terms of live video riots in which the perpetrator as well as the accused are both making videos itself has really kind of disrupted that understanding of the temporal gap, so that now we don't even know then what the difference between fact and narrative or event and narrative is. The ethical argument that one would have made, or the political argument that one would have been made in a classical moment would have been that we need to turn to narrative, right? That information, narrative has to rescue information to be intelligible or to have a sensibility beyond it being information. I don't even know what that means any longer. I would still hold on to the argument that Laura Marx makes when she distinguishes between information and the image, where she says that if you take, for example, let's say, compare two regimes of imagery, the cinematic on the one hand and CCTV on the other, says the amount of footage that is created, and now the numbers must be much larger, I'm talking about like 10, 15 years ago, the statistic was for every hour that we spend, there is 1 million hours of video that is produced, and mostly produced by cameras that don't have a human looking behind the screen, right? Now, of course, I'm pretty sure that the numbers are much vaster. So what does it then mean to think about actually creating an image any longer? Right? Do you do it in the classical Autorian sense to say that I'm going to move away from this, which is a move of transcendence, and rescue the image from its immersion within the world of information, which would be a romantic move, right? It would be a move of transcendence to say that mine is somehow post-political, or it's the aesthetic. Or you actually then begin also to think about immersive practices that rescue and create images from within this frame. So there's a very interesting film, which is an experimental movie by a contemporary media artist called Manu Luksh. And the movie is called Faceless. It's a remarkable instance of the coming together of these different registers: aesthetics, politics, and tactical practice. What Manu Luksh did was that London, which had 70% of your waking life in London in the streets is covered by surveillance cameras, there was a contradictory regime, because it said on the one hand you have the right to privacy, which means that you have the right to access all of the images that have been captured of you in public spaces through the Right to Information Act. But at the same time, you can't have your information given to you without violating someone else's privacy. So if Tanuja and I are both in the ATM and our images are captured, I have the right to my image, but not to Tanuja's image. So it became incumbent upon the state to give me my image, having blackened out Tanuja's. Right? So what she did as an artistic intervention was to use the Right to Information Act to ask for all of the images in which she had been a part of. But not only did she do that, she also orchestrated public events in public spaces, including a dance. And the idea was, how do you use infrastructures which belong to the state and are part of the surveillance apparatus to create a counter-forensic and a counter-aesthetic. And she made a movie called Faceless, which is a science fiction film in which a woman wakes up one day to find that she has a face and everyone else has lost their face. And she goes to try to recover what happened to all of these faces. So that for me is an interesting example of how you can create a a kind of an aesthetic practice grounded within, in a way, the idea of the forensic fantasy that doesn't necessarily transcend it, but imminently kind of, implodes it. The implosion for this resulted in the amendment to the Right to Information Act, because the British government suddenly realized that it cost them so much money to blacken the faces of people in videos and give it that they amended the law to say that now you can't access it. Many lessons to be learned in our university.
Absolutely. In fact, no, he's gone now. Yes, please. What is your question, Akshay?
It's a methodological question in a sense. And this is at the point where you're going from the fascinating reading of Gauba to you're reading the reader. Where you're talking about the attachment that the masses have to the wounded body, etc. I think that's a fascinating move that you're making, but it raises a big methodological question for me. Because as I understand it, if you're looking at a social psychology kind of thing, you're talking about in some sense, a matrix of affects, a matrix of attachments. So, for example, you talk about Sushant Singh's case. Now, there is the attachment to the wounded body, but we also must keep in mind that this is happening during the COVID pandemic. This is, in some sense, a harnessing of the psychic energy that is being produced by the trauma of the lockdowns, etc. And the Bihari body being placed as against, and there's a way in which that psychic energy is being brought into the surface of the nation itself. Right? That's the way in which the SSR story plays out. So it's not, attachment that there is in social psyche is necessarily a part of multiple others. Now, what that throws a challenge to, I think, a law and literature approach. And I'm wondering whether you, how you tackle that, or was that still a challenge for you? Because you have to, in some sense, constitute that matrix. You have to constitute the assemblage of affects that constitute that readership. Yeah. Because you're constructing for us something of a genealogy of the attachments of the masses, right? Through the stories. So that's what makes it so fascinating. So I'm wondering how you tackle that methodological challenge, because I'm struggling with that.
Very important question. I think that the methodological challenge would have been much more difficult in an earlier period, which was the print culture period. Because then the only options available to you would either have been an empirical turn or an empirical move to say who's the empirical reader, or to rely on what literary theory does, which is through the aid of genre, to imagine the idea of the speculative reading public, right? And you do it through precisely the formation that genre analysis allows you to do. So I'm obviously not doing, I'm not looking at the empirical reader when I look at this. When I say that it's a lot easier today, it's because the reader is also in a way an active participant. Particularly, for example, like in something like the Sushant Singh Rajput case, there are no authors apart from the readers, right? So you move from the domain of consumption to the domain of circulation. So whether it is Twitter or it is Facebook or it is, the large number of YouTube videos where people are actually producing their analysis of this, you're actually moving into a zone where text and context is actually, the line between the two is entirely blurred. It's not as sharply divided as it was in the earlier moment. So to my mind, actually the methodological kind of thing is a lot more easier. Now, does it make it, do we then claim that this is the empirical reader that we are now, enumerating? I think that's always going to be a limited task. There is no absolute empirical claim that one will be able to make outside of an amalgamation or an assemblage of the sensibilities, the responses, as well as the participatory economy with which this is being produced. Right?
All right, I think we've had a very interesting presentation and a very interesting discussion. I also wonder whether the fact, and I want to go back to where I started, the fact that we came to know the courtroom through cinema, right? And the dramatic courtroom scene, which used to be the hallmark of the ending point of any of the earlier cinema. The fact that now those are missing in what we see today is also a result of this constant forensic context in which like everything is known and everything is there and so on. So it is no longer, so the lawyer is not the one, as you earlier spoke about, an empathetic lawyer who's kind of trying to find a balance between the what is strange and what is not, and what is legal, right? But it is about somebody clever who finds a clever thing which kind of turns things. So so those are the kind of questions that we are like left with, in this constant production of images, in constant consumption of images, of information, of, where we are like, we feel that we know everything and yet we do not. So thank you so much, Lawrence, for bringing these questions to us, and please continue to be a part of our colloquium. Professor Dangwal is our next speaker, and we will post the information as it comes. Thank you very much.